Former Beatle John Lennon is dead. Lennon died in a hospital shortly after being shot outside his New York apartment tonight.
Hello and welcome to Between the Facts. This is episode 3. Today we are looking at the life, the death, and the conspiracies surrounding John Lennon. This is going to be a 2-part episode, so 3.1, 3.2, because there's a lot to cover here. There's a lot of impact. You know, it's impossible to talk about Lennon without talking about his group, the Beatles, and the impact that the Beatles had. Before we go into the podcast, I'd just like to say that we're very, very proud that we've become affiliated with the One Grump podcast network now. 2021 shows, podcasts, YouTube stations, covering all kinds of entertainment, you know, movie reviews, horror, true crime, etc. You can go over to youronpodcast.com, have a look at all the shows that make up the network, try them out, follow, like, they're all on Instagram, the usual social medias, give them a follow. You know, we like to call it the home of entertainment, and we hope you agree. So that we cover the impact of John Lennon and the Beatles and their rise to fame and what drove them to want to be so successful, what we've got is some clips from our old podcast, One Grump or Two, with the UK's leading Beatles historian, David Bedford. So these clips will be popping in throughout as we talk. I think it's important to get some real good solid facts in here for you. John Winston Lennon was born October 9th, 1940 in Liverpool Maternity Hospital. Actually born during a German bombing raid. Born in the Blitz. You know, you'd certainly expect that to set up some kind of struggle for the rest of your life. John was born to his mum, Julia, and they spent their first hours together, hiding or sheltering in the hospital as the bombs fell. Wartime Liverpool was marked by rationing, destruction, and uncertainty, you know, which echoed so many British towns, villages during the Second World War. John was named after his paternal grandfather, Jack Lennon, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, which obviously shows a lot of national pride at the time of the war. John's dad, Alfred Freddie Lennon, was a merchant seaman who spent much of his time at sea. He was, by all accounts, charming and good-natured, but he wasn't that steady presence that maybe John needed as a father figure. His mum, Julia Stanley Lennon, by all accounts again, was vibrant, unconventional. She had a real love of music, a fun-loving personality, but struggled with the responsibilities of raising a child. And, you know, in that time, with all that uncertainty in the city, I don't think there's a massive element of surprise there. Freddie and Julia's marriage broke down early, and by the time John was 4 years old, Freddie had almost completely disappeared from his life. In 1946, Freddie briefly returned and attempted to take John to New Zealand, but his mum Julia intercepted them, leading to a dramatic scene where young John was asked to choose between his parents. John chose his mother, but lately expressed deep confusion and emotional scars from this incident. What an awful thing to happen to a child, to any child, to be plonked in between two arguing adults and being told to choose one now. Not long after, Julia decided that John would be better cared for by her older sister, Mary Mimi Smith, and her husband, George. Mimi was much more of a traditional and disciplined mother, and it was felt that steady environment would benefit John far more greatly. John lived at Mendips, a tidy and tiny middle-class home in Woolton, and that's a district of Liverpool. Mimi provided structure, which was hoped for, but often clashed with John over his rebellious tendencies. Despite having that more structured approach to parenting, Mimi was very, very supportive of John's education and his creative interests, and even going so far as to buy his first guitar for him. Wow. Can you imagine having that? You are the person that bought John Lennon his first guitar. Wow, that's just incredible. That. So although John lived with Mimi, he did maintain a close bond with Julia. Julia lived fairly close by, and John saw Julia's home as a place of fun and musical exploration, introducing John to Elvis Presley records, teaching him banjo chords, and encouraging his interest in music. John attended Dovedale Primary School, where he displayed early signs of intelligence and creativity, thankfully. However, his mischievous nature often got him into trouble with the teachers, and this is something we'll see as he goes through Dovedale and then through Quarrybank, which is his high school. He enjoyed drawing, storytelling, creating humorous and imaginative sketches. Unexpectedly, his antics would get him into trouble, and was more than probably part of the reason for his lack of academic interest. In reality, academia didn't capture his imagination. Teachers would describe him as bright but lazy, but I think he showed that as he grew into a young man, then into a fully fledged man, although he took that very strange route of becoming incredibly famous, he was a very, very intelligent person. After Dovedale, he went to Quarrybank High School, and becoming a teenager in high school, that's where his rebellious streak became more pronounced. Being known for his sharp wit, sarcastic humour, and disdain for authority, not a lot changed there, did it? After Quarrybank High School, John enrolled in the Liverpool College of Art. He showed a very strong aptitude for drawing. His creative side was really coming out, and he was really enjoying seeing the mixtures of cultures within there. But unfortunately, his rebellious streak just led to more and more conflict, and eventually he dropped out. The art school was where he came across this more bohemian lifestyle, which would not only give him new ideas, new things to examine and to think about, but also became an influence on his creative style and outlook. And we'll pop over to a clip from David now about how the music scene in Liverpool during the war and post-war was driving that interest in new and fresh music.
Liverpool had this huge country and western scene, the biggest country and western scene, certainly in the UK, probably in Europe. And that was the music that the Beatles generation grew up with. You know, John Lennon was a huge Hank Williams fan. And if you listen to Hank Williams, you can hear the beginnings of rock and roll. You know, he had a great song, Move It On Over. You listen to that, and a few years later, with a slight twist and change of lyrics, that's Rock Around the Clock. It's the same melody. So those early inspirations were all American, and what Liverpool was doing, what the Beatles were doing, was taking American music, whether it's folk music, country music, soul, whatever it was, repackaging it, putting a Liverpool accent on it, then selling it back to them. They had these smart suits, and they were bringing American culture back with them. But that's only part of it. You've then got to add in that during the Second World War, Liverpool was the second most bombed city in Britain, because we report, turn of the 20th century, we were as important and sometimes more important than London was as a port. So because all the supplies that were coming in from the US and Canada were coming into Liverpool, we were the target for the Luftwaffe. So we got really heavily bombed, which is the city the Beatles were born into. The May Blitz, May 41, where there's like 4,000 people died. In some parts of Liverpool, they lost 3/4 of the houses. About 75,000 were made homeless. It was a huge, devastating effect of all these bombs that were landing in Liverpool. But just outside Liverpool was an airbase called Burton Wood, and that was just by Warrington, halfway between Liverpool and Manchester. End of the 50s, early 60s, there was still probably over 15,000 US airmen based there. when they had their downtime, nearest town to go to was into Liverpool. Now, because of segregation in the US, the base was segregated. So instead of letting them all go into town together where they'd be fighting, the white guys went into the city centre. And because we've always had this large Afro-Caribbean community, the black servicemen then went to the black clubs. John, Paul, and George used to hang out in the black clubs. And so as well as the music, they were then meeting Americans who were bringing their records with them and their music with them. And they were finding obscure songs which weren't released yet in this country. So you had this American culture. So you got the Cunard Yanks bringing the records in. You got the American servicemen that they're meeting. You got this obsession with everything American, with the Westerns, cowboys and Indians. Yeah, so every Saturday morning you'd be at the movies watching that. There'd be the comics. American culture was everywhere. Most importantly, though, for the music was Radio Luxembourg. And they'd set up, I think in the early 1930s, to broadcast of this little principality in Europe, broadcasting music into the UK, which you could pick up. Now, I think the Nazis used it during the war to broadcast all the Lord Haw and all that. But after the war, obviously, it returned to doing pop music. That is where, if you want to listen to the latest pop music, and certainly the latest American music, you tuned in to Radio Luxembourg, particularly on a Sunday night, and they'd have American DJs on there, and they would go through the chart music. That's how the lads like the Quarrymen were learning their songs. That's how often they were learning their lyrics. Because there's a famous story that McCartney tells on the day that he met John, and he says the Quarrymen were performing "Come Go With Me" by the Del Vikings. Paul said, "No, he's making up his own words by going down to the penitentiary," and Paul thought that was cool. That was because they didn't know what the words were. So you either went into a record shop, went into a booth and listened to it and scribbled down what you were listening to, or you listened to Radio Luxembourg. They couldn't work out that second line. So they just threw something that sort of worked. So a lot of the time you didn't have access to sheet music, and you didn't always want to go and buy the records because you didn't have the money. So John found a better way of doing that. I think today we call it kleptomania. So he was terrible for it, and he'd go into record stores and slip them down his trousers or whatever. He'd nick them. Very, very rarely did he buy a record. Very rarely. So this is how you're getting the music. So you've got all these different bits of culture coming into Liverpool, and that's why it could only have happened here. Because you go back with the history of the city with being a port. The oldest Chinese community in Europe, second oldest Jewish community, and you've got one of the largest Afro-Caribbean communities, and then of course with the Irish migration from the Great Famine in the 1840s, where 1.5 million Irish people passed through Liverpool, and of course thousands stayed, of which John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr can all trace Irish heritage. Those Irish people who stayed really affected Liverpool as well. So you've got all of that culture, and it's almost like it's the perfect storm with the timing of, look at 1956, teenagers for the first time, because it used to be, age 14 or 15, you could leave school, go straight to work. Now you could stay until 16, and you could have disposable income. You could stay on further, you could do apprenticeships. Suddenly there was this new market. And then 1956, Rock Island Line comes out, Lonnie Donegan, Heartbreak Hotel, Elvis, Long Tall Sally, Little Richard. They are the three songs that transformed the lives of the Beatles in a short space of time.
In 1956, at the age of 16, John formed his first band, and one of the very, very, very popular types of music at the time was skiffle, and here we are, the skiffle band, the Quarrymen, named after the school, Quarrybank High School. Skiffle was a blend of jazz, blues, and folk, and as I said, it was extremely popular. The group would perform at local events and did get some following. it was all about his raw talent, though, that made him stand out for the rest of the band. In July of 1957, at a church fete in Woolton, John met for the first time Paul McCartney. Paul impressed John with his ability to tune a guitar and play complex chords. I just love that. I love the fact that two of the greatest songwriting minds, the greatest songwriting duo of all time, started with somebody being impressed that somebody could tune a guitar. John hits 18 and he has shifted his focus completely. Laser focus straight onto his music, and with this budding and growing partnership with Paul McCartney, they started to write songs together. Very quickly, the Quarrymen evolved into the Beatles. Lennon's role in the Beatles was central to the band's identity and success. As co-founder, primary songwriter and vocalist, he would bring with him a unique mix of creativity, wit and raw emotion. The growing partnership with McCartney, complemented by the talents of Ringo Starr and George Harrison, would propel them to become, quite simply, the most successful band, and some would say most influential band, in music history. We'll pop over now for Dan to give us an overview, a look at how Lennon wrote his songs, the importance of his writing style.
As we just touched upon, John Lennon, as one of the founding members of the Beatles, was one of the most influential and versatile songwriters of the 20th century. His songwriting is marked by deep emotional honesty, a flair for innovation, and a profound ability to tap into universal themes. Across his career, from the Beatles to his solo work, Lennon's songs evolved from energetic pop hits to introspective and often socially conscious pieces. In his time with the Beatles in the early years, Lennon co-wrote and performed some of the most iconic songs of the 1960s. Tracks like Please Please Me and Help exemplified his ability to write catchy, heartfelt melodies. His contributions often stood out for their raw emotional edge and personal introspection, particularly in songs like If I Feel and In My Life. But it's as the band matured, Lennon began exploring deeper, more experimental themes. On albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, he pushed the boundaries of pop songwriting with tracks like Tomorrow Never Knows and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Lennon's ability to blend surreal imagery with poignant lyricism reached its zenith in songs like Strawberry Fields Forever, a haunting reflection on memory and identity.
Paranormal Misfits. Besties Nino Daniel and Chrissy D with their podcast looking at the paranormal, mysteries and unravelling mind-boggling conspiracies. Available on all platforms, YouTube and part of the You-Run podcast network.
You've got to take into account the fact they stopped touring as well at the end of August 66. They're off doing a few solo projects as well. So when John starts writing Strawberry Fields Forever, he's in Spain filming How I Won the War. He's got some spare time. Yeah. So there's lots of different factors. And one is that Paul has started writing Penny Lane after John has started working on In My Life. Now, the original draft of In My Life is a list of the places John remembered. His first one being Penny Lane is what I'm missing. And he talks about the places you go on the bus, Church Road, the Picton Clock, the Abbey Cinema, the Dutch Cafe, St Columba's Youth Club. He made a list of the places he remembered. Couldn't make it work, scrapped it, reworked the song. That's what geniuses do. But it started a discussion with Paul. He was saying, should we start writing songs about our childhood in Liverpool? So Paul starts on Penny Lane. John starts on Strawberry Fields Forever. They then have the discussion, well, do we make an album about our childhood in Liverpool? That then gets foiled because they've not had a single out for ages, and Brian says, we've got to put something out. And the only two songs that were ready were Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. So they get put out in Feb 67. And of course, certainly for the UK albums, If it came out as a single, it wouldn't appear on an album. So that idea disappeared of the Liverpool album. You know, you look back to the story of John Lennon, and when he gets to 65 and he writes the song Help, and most people completely missed the point with Help. It's, you know, it's this fast, boppy pop song, absolute cry for help. Help me if you can, I'm feeling down. As he's singing, goes, smiling away. Oh, and you can hear the pain. And he said, I was crying for help and nobody was listening. He had all the money he wanted, all the women he wanted, all the fame he wanted, no contentment. And that's why, coming back in a way to Strawberry Fields Forever, I think that's why he wrote that. Because he was going back to a time when he was 13 years old, playing with his mates in the grounds of Strawberry Field. His father figure, Uncle George, was still alive. His mum was still alive. Stuart was still alive. There was no Beatles, none of that manic looniness. He was truly happy. That's what he wanted. He wanted that feeling to last forever. That's what he was going back to for Strawberry Fields. And he knew that he'd lost that. And he wanted somehow to get back to the grounds of Strawberry Field, being 13 and being happy again. I think the thing that John got right from the very beginning, that when he first invited Paul to join the Quarrymen in 57, John didn't have an ego, because for him, all that mattered was the music. They were never going to go further than they were. They were a skiffle group, a group of friends having a laugh. He wanted to do rock and roll. Paul comes along. He's a guy who can do it. Paul invites him. John invites Paul to join. When they become a rock and roll group in 60, and everybody said, what are you going to call yourselves? And said, we've got this name, the Beatles. That's stupid. You've got to be Long John and the Silver Beatles. You've got to be you and the Somethings. Nobody could ever persuade John to change that. He never wanted that. It was always about the group. It was always about the music. It was never about his ego. Now, there's a power play, because it was John's group to start with. I think you see the shift through the mid-60s towards Paul, because Paul lent more towards pop music. John was the rocker, and they were drifting away from that. You then see the massive shift when Brian dies in the summer of 67. They got no manager. They always said they wouldn't have anybody apart from Brian. Paul is the one who tries to keep them together. He then becomes part manager. So his project's a Magical Mystery Tour. His project is Let It Be. He's trying to find ways to keep the group together. So the power has shifted. And by that time, John was starting to say, I can't be bothered anymore. He was drifting off to his thing, and the group is disintegrating. So I don't think it was ever set up as John's or Paul's, but I think that's naturally how it went. But the good thing about John is that there was never that ego to say, I'm the leader, I'm the boss.
After the Beatles disbanded in 1970, Lennon embarked on a solo career that further showcased his introspective and activist tendencies. His debut solo album, Plastic Ono Band, is a stark, emotionally raw masterpiece, featuring songs like Mother and Working Class Hero, where he openly confronted his childhood traumas and societal frustrations. Lennon's follow-up album, Imagine, included his most famous solo song, the title track, Imagine, a utopian anthem for peace and unity. The song's simplicity and universal message solidified Lennon's place as a voice for social change. Other highlights from his solo career include Instant Karma and Jealous Guy, which combined his knack for melodic hooks and deeply personal lyrics. Throughout the 1970s, Lennon's work frequently explored themes of love and relationship, particularly his devotion to Yoko Ono, as heard in songs like Oh My Love and Woman. His final album, Double Fantasy, released shortly before his death in 1980, reflected a sense of contentment and hope, as seen in Starting Over and Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy. From the groundbreaking experimentation of his Beatles years to the intimate candour of his solo work, Lennon's songwriting remains a testament to his unique ability to connect with listeners on both a personal and a global scale. Now, I, for one, speaking personally, am a fan of the later Beatles, the more experimental, the more raw side of it than the candy pop of the early part of the 60s. And as growing up as a teenager, I was fascinated by Lennon's work on those, especially his solo work. Let's just move the Yoko Ono side of the albums completely aside. In fact, maybe forget about them, unless you like Screaming in a Bag. But there is certain angst to his beautiful melodic pieces, and lyrically, it's quite hard to listen to at times. But in that lies its actual beauty. But I also want to talk about the importance of his songwriting relationship with Paul McCartney. In the early years, they co-wrote many songs, working side by side to create classics like I Want to Hold Your Hand and Can't Buy Me Love. And as their styles evolved, they began writing more independently, but they continued to influence each other. Lennon's introspective tendencies were counterbalanced by McCartney's more polished and structured style, resulting in songs that we've discussed, or Phil's touched on, like A Day in the Life, which is Lennon's haunting verses, which are complemented by McCartney's buoyant middle section, which is something I've always found in their solo works post-Beatles, is there's a definite angst to Lennon's side, and there is a definite more poppy side to the McCartney output. But let's not forget that McCartney, although has had the longer career, obviously, is just a relentless workhorse, and the quality is mixed at times, especially in later days. But I think there's a lot of gold in them, their hills. Their creative tension pushed both to excel. Lennon's experimentalism challenged McCartney to take risks, while McCartney's attention to detail grounded Lennon's raw creativity. Together, they produced some of the greatest songs in modern music, from Hey Jude to Strawberry Fields Forever. And even as the Beatles began to fragment, their collaborative legacy continued to define the band's enduring appeal. It's a shame that they both fell out to the extent that they did. I know that they parted shots at each other through song, with Lennon famously singing The Only Thing You Wrote Was Yesterday, spitefully having a pop at Macca, even though they are both credited on that song, despite only one of them actually writing it. But ultimately, it's their partnership that exemplified how two distinct artistic voices, when combined, can create something greater than the sum of their parts. Their collaboration remains a testament to the power of teamwork and mutual inspiration in creative endeavours. And it's nice to know that before Lennon's death, they were on a path to rekindling that beautiful relationship. And let's not forget, it's those two names, Lennon and McCartney, that have written some of the greatest songs of all time.
John married Cynthia Powell in 1962, welcoming their only son Julian in 1963. Only a few short years later, though, he would actually meet Yoko Ono at an art gallery in London in 1966. Both of them were married, and their relationship started on artistic projects. They began exchanging letters and collaborating. However, though, they did start a romantic relationship in 1968, which led to the dissolution of their respective marriages. Being married to Yoko Ono brought out the activism, the activist side of John's personality. You know, they're well remembered for Bed-Ins for Peace and the release of their anti-war single Give Peace a Chance. John would make the move to New York in 1971, with Yoko moving into the 7th floor apartment of the Dakota building in 1973. They would live there until the fateful day in 1980. A quick word now from David as to why John may have felt so comfortable in New York coming all the way from Liverpool.
Liverpool has always had more in common with America than with the rest of the UK. Well, that led me to do one of the books that I published. I did with two friends of mine, Richard Porter and Susan Ryan. Was I recognised the similarity with New York the first time I went there, because up until that point, I could never understand why John Lennon, having grown up in Liverpool, would want to go and live in New York. And I went there for the first time and went, oh, I get it. It's just New York, Manhattan, that whole area. That's just a very, very big Liverpool. So the three of us, we did a book called The Beatles' Fab Four Cities. And we looked at the four cities that defined the Beatles' career: Liverpool, Hamburg, London, New York. And look at the similarities and the connections. All major port cities, transient population, quite a unique identity, and all connected by shipping, going back a long, long way. And we realised how many similarities and connections there were, not just for the Beatles, but historically, geographically, between those four cities. And it just, because the three of us had all visited each other's cities, and we'd all got that same feeling. You felt at home in one of those, one of the other cities. And you could understand then. It's like when I first went to Hamburg, I walked down by the riverside and thought, I can see why they felt at home, where they've got an overhead railway like Liverpool used to have. Well, when the Beatles were there, they'd grown up with having an overhead railway going down by the River Mersey. They get to the front in Hamburg, there's their overhead railway.
Between 71 and 80, John continued a steady stream of releases, 6 albums over the 9 years. In 76, welcoming his son Sean. Between 77, 79, it looked like he'd given up on music to some degree, looking after Sean as a newborn. He released his final album, Double Fantasy, in 1980. This was released 3 weeks before he was shot and killed. What an absolute loss to the music world, to his family, his friends. What a pointless waste of a human life. On Monday, the 8th of December 1980, John and Yoko had been engaged in various activities, which would be fairly normal for them. They'd been doing some promotional activities for Double Fantasy. They'd done a photo shoot for Annie Leibovitz for Rolling Stone. You'll know the photograph that came from that session. It's the one of John naked, curled around Yoko Ono. And they'd even been and done a radio interview where John had expressed his excitement about coming back into music and how optimistic he was for the future. It was at 5 o'clock as they left the Dakota building that they actually bumped into Mark David Chapman for the first time. He was a 25-year-old man from Hawaii who asked Lennon to sign a copy of Double Fantasy. Lennon did. The moment is caught by a photographer, which is, I don't know, is it a coincidence? It's bizarre. And with John asking Chapman if is this all you want before leaving with Yoko? It's just such a strange thing to think that around about 10:50, John and Yoko had returned to the Dakota building. If anybody knows the structure of New York, 72nd Street, where the Dakota building is, runs along by Central Park. It is a desirable area to live in. So they'd exited their limousine, and as they passed under the archway of the Dakota, he stepped out of the shadows, Mark David Chapman, firing 5 shots, 4 of which struck John in the back and shoulder. According to the reports at the time, the wounds caused massive internal damage. Lennon managed to stagger a few steps into the building before collapsing. and the building's doorman, Jose Perdomo, disarmed Chapman, who made absolutely no attempt to flee and remained at the scene reading a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. When the police arrived, Chapman calmly surrendered and said, "I acted alone. I have just shot John Lennon." Wow. He was taken to the nearby Roosevelt Hospital and was pronounced dead at 11:15 on that day. We will look at more in depth at John's death, the circumstances surrounding it, the close call for another musician with Mark David Chapman a previous day, and then some of the conspiracies surrounding John's death in part 2. So I hope you've enjoyed part 1. Thank you very much for joining us. See you when part 2 comes out really, really soon. Thanks a lot. Take care.